So good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about diesel combustion and spark ignition engine knock modeling. But before I start on that, I thought I would show you a movie that I stole from the internet that I think is kind of impressive. Maybe you've seen it as well. There's no sound. "96-centimeter bore." "80 megawatt." That's the bearings. Crankshaft in pieces. So isn't that amazing? What's the RPM? 70 RPM. I beg your pardon? 77 RPM is the engine speed. Okay. So that's just to help motivate today a little bit. We're talking about diesels. Diesel combustion, okay? And then, as I mentioned, SI engines as well. So diesel engines are basically the workhorse on this planet. We use them for on-highway vehicles. You just saw a marine. Power generation, locomotives, off-highway vehicles, mining, haulers, loaders, and then also in stationary applications in the petroleum industry. They are, as I say, the workhorse. And this is a picture you just saw out of that movie. The Wärtsilä makes the largest engine that I know of. So diesel combustion, as we discussed right at the beginning, the characteristics are you intake pressurized air through your turbocharger system, your compressor turbocharger system, and then fuel is injected into this high temperature, high pressure gas as a result of the compression process. Load is controlled by the quantity of fuel that you inject. And actually, if you can see from this picture here, you have a highly heterogeneous mixture. Locally, you can have very high equivalence ratios within the spray region, and outside of the spray region, obviously, just air. So there's a wide range of mixture concentration spatially within the combustion chamber. This little chart here summarizes some of the characteristics of the various size classes. The combustion chamber is typically characterized as being quiescent. That means a kind of a shallow bowl configuration where most of the mixing of the fuel and air is accomplished by the fuel injection process. This occurs in the largest engines, like that Wärtsilä engine, with very low RPM, on the order of 100 RPM for those huge engines. Here you see the bore size going up to 900 millimeters, right? So that's almost a meter. Compression ratio would be on the order of 12 or so, 12 to 15. Multiple nozzle holes, actually multiple injectors even in those large engines. So I've heard people explain it this way, that every cycle you can take a coffee cup of fuel and pour it into the engine. And that's probably not a real good estimate, but it's on the low side of how much fuel is used every cycle in those large engines. Then as you go to medium speed diesel, you start to see some changes, higher swirl ratios, compression ratios in the 15 to 16 range. Injection pressure is not as high as in the large bore engine, because now you're starting to use some of the features of the fluid mechanics in the combustion space generated by the compression process. And then finally, for the small diesel engines, these are typically characterized with high swirl, relatively low injection pressures, so although this is increasing. People are interested in higher injection pressure to enable better mixing and reduce smoke, as we discussed yesterday a little. Here you see speeds that can range all the way up to 5,000 RPM. Bore sizes down to 80 millimeters for the small high-speed diesels. So that just gives you an idea of the range, where we're going from 80 millimeters to 800 millimeters in bore in a diesel engine. And it's amazing that it can operate over such wide ranges of dimensions. So some guidelines: if you happen to be a diesel designer, you would like to create the following. You would like to put the fuel injector as close to the center of symmetry in your combustion chamber. This helps avoid having regions where you might have, because of the inhomogeneity, even more inhomogeneity on one side of the chamber than the other, which could cause trouble with particulates and so on. You'll see the combustion process is really controlled largely by the injection pressure and the shape, the rate shape of the injection. You might have multiple injections, for instance. Those are all going to be determining factors when it comes to the performance of the engine. The injection timing, the number, diameter, the angle of the sprays, and how they are matched with the piston bowl are all important. For high-speed diesel engines, the intake port geometry, generally you could have swirl generation or even tumble generation, depending on the design of the intake system. The boost pressure, whether you have an intercooler to control the pressure and temperature at the intake valve closure. Compression ratio, the amount of exhaust gas that you recirculate, these are all design parameters. As far as the piston bowl is concerned, the reentrancy, or basically the shape of the piston bowl, and the size of the piston bowl. Generally, the reason you have a piston bowl is to try to keep the spray confined and prevent spray from impinging against the liner. Key parameter here is to make sure you have enough air to be able to burn the fuel required such that you can meet your peak torque, design torque limit. You want, of course, the optimized injection timings, compression ratios, and here you are basically having to deal with improving the fuel efficiency and emissions. Of course, there are constraints. The peak cylinder pressure, even though they're a lot higher than in a spark ignition engine because of the sturdiness of the engine, you still have cylinder pressure constraints, also fuel injection pressure constraints. So those are some of the design criteria that a designer starts out on day one considering. So diesel combustion has been analyzed for many, many years. And as I showed you really on the first day, one can make a cylinder pressure measurement with a transducer and using the first law of thermodynamics, convert that into an apparent heat release and get a plot that looks something like this here. This would be your apparent heat release rate versus crank angle, top dead center over here someplace. You started injecting over here. There was this ignition delay. Then there's this very intense period of heat release as that fuel that has been injected reaches its ignition point and goes off with a bang. And then the subsequent part of this curve represents continuing injection and burning the injected fuel in a diffusion burning mode. So John Deck, some years ago, using optical diagnostics, showed some details in a transparent engine that led him to this conceptual model here. You inject the fuel, these fuel droplets exchange their momentum with the air and get the air moving, which then entrains high temperature air into the spray, mixing with the fuel. And at a certain moment, a region of chemical reaction starts to take place. This you'll see in a minute. We can identify a two-stage combustion process where the first stage of combustion takes place really near the location where the fuel-air mixture has reached an optimized level. And then this region here, this yellow region, corresponds to a region where you would find PAH species, basically a fuel-rich region. And the green line you see here represents the diffusion flame. You have air on the outer side, the outer periphery of the jet, and a fuel-rich region in the interior of the jet. In this case, this is early in the injection. There's a head vortex here, as we saw in some of the simulations yesterday. And very rich region, again, where soot formation is likely to occur. And these pictures from John Deck's paper here show this progression in time. First, you have the liquid injection. The liquid evaporates and reaching a certain liquid length. The vapor continues to penetrate. This vapor starts to break down and form PAH species or intermediate combustion products. And then finally soot starts to appear, soot particles, and eventually they agglomerate to form what we would call particulate. So that was John Deck's contribution, which I think has generated a lot of interest and discussion about diesel sprays and diesel combustion. As I showed you last time, we also have from that soot cloud at the tip of the spray radiation. There's a high temperature field. And so in conventional diesel, this would be a typical picture that you would see for, in this case, it's a 6-plume injector. And you're looking at the situation when those spray plumes are just reaching the edge of the piston bowl. One of the concerns, of course, with standard diesel combustion is that it generates both particulates and nitric oxide. The particulates coming from the rich regions in the interior of the jet, and the nitric oxide coming from the diffusion flame at the boundary of the jet, where the temperatures are the highest. So one way of trying to deal with that is to use what's called early injection, partially premixed combustion, or premixed charge compression ignition. And the idea here is to try to allow as much time between the beginning of the injection or even the end of injection and the start of combustion. In that way, to reduce the equivalence ratios locally in the combustion chamber. Professor Kamimoto and his group produced this plot here, which is very interesting, which basically serves to give some guidance as to the equivalence ratio temperature domains that result in emissions of soot, nitric oxide, and unburnt fuel and CO. And basically what it shows is that in a certain temperature range, particularly in this range around 2000 Kelvin here, if the equivalence ratios locally are high enough, you will generate significant amounts of soot. This represents kind of a boundary that you would like to stay below in order to avoid soot. So that means that locally in the combustion chamber, you want to keep equivalence ratios as low as possible. And in fact, below 2 is kind of a guidance from experimental work. As far as nitric oxide is concerned, that shows up when the temperatures are above 2000 Kelvin locally. So one way to try to deal with that is to dilute the charge here with exhaust gases. to lower the combustion temperatures. So that would be part and parcel of using PCCI strategies. But you can see that there's actually good news for combustion. There is a regime here. If you can operate between, say, 1600, 1500 Kelvin temperatures to 2000, and equivalence ratios below stoichiometric, there is the possibility of operating with very low soot and nitric oxide while still maintaining combustion efficiency such that you can minimize CO and unburned hydrocarbons. If you look at conventional diesel combustion, someplace in the combustion chamber, you're going to have rich regions at low temperature. You're going to have regions that are lean at high temperature. And these are going to give you the soot, and these are going to give you the nitric oxide. If you look at the low temperature combustion regimes, you want to stay away from the nitric oxide producing part of this chart. Here would be a typical PCCI operating regime. You would have regions that are close to stoichiometric in parts of the combustion chamber and regions that are relatively lean. Homogeneous charge compression ignition, here you want to operate with essentially very low equivalence ratio to avoid smoke, and you want to operate highly dilute in order to avoid nitric oxide. But you can see there's a close connection between the CCIs here. You're operating in that clean regime. Homogeneous charge compression ignition, unfortunately, doesn't offer you the same type of control that you would have with a direct injected engine. Of course, you can create a homogeneous charge by injecting very, very early, but the problem is that you need precise control over the charge preparation in order to ensure that ignition occurs at the right time in the combustion cycle. So that makes HCCI difficult to control, even though you're able to operate over a range that produces very little in the way of NOx and soot. So PCCI is of great interest because it provides more control. So if we look back at the diesel combustion regimes and look in a little bit more detail at conventional diesel, as I mentioned, John Deck used optical diagnostics, and what he discovered was that he could identify this low temperature combustion or first phase combustion regime where there's very little heat release, followed by a region where you would have aldehydes and PAHs developing, and then your soot. If you look at where OH is located, basically it is located in a region around the developing jet in the diffusion flame region. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So that came from his experimental work. And recently, or more recently, Mark Musculus and the group at Sandia have looked at another combustion regime, the low temperature diesel combustion regime, and compared their measured structures to those of the conventional diesel. They see some similarity. Here's your liquid jet. You've got vaporization occurring. Then this blue region that you see here is basically priming for the combustion event. You see the aldehydes and so on. This green region is a region that's filled with OH. So OH basically is observed to fill the entire jet. And then there'd be some soot located in the region where you have a recirculation zone or a head vortex at the head of the jet. So the structure is quite different. This region here basically expands to fill the whole jet in low temperature combustion. So in order to see if the models could capture some of these trends, we did some simulation work using the Kiva code that I've been describing to you. That was also implemented with the chemistry solvers, in this case using Chemkin. The diesel fuel chemistry was modeled with our reduced N-heptane mechanism to represent a surrogate for diesel. In this case, each of these computational cells is considered as a well-stirred reactor. Flame propagation is also modeled using the level set or the G equation model that I described last time. And then the spray, we used the models that we discussed yesterday, the gas jet theory to reduce grid size dependency, collision model, including bounce, coalescence, fragmenting, non-fragmenting separations, and so on, the Kelvin-Helmholtz-Rayleigh-Taylor breakup. And then for the fuel properties, the physical properties, we used tetradecane. It's closer to that of conventional diesel fuel. So here is the experimental setup in Mark Masculis's lab at Sandia. Basically, Mark took over this lab from John Deck, so it's basically the same engine that John used earlier. It's a Cummins N14 direct injection diesel engine. It has an extended piston called a Bowditch piston. So the piston, the engine piston is down here, and then there's this extended region that allows you to insert a mirror and optics, and then, of course, a transparent piston. In the case of Mark's engine, the piston geometry is very simple. It's just a rectangular cylindrical geometry. And then you'll notice he even has side windows, and then one of the exhaust valves is replaced with a window. So there's a huge amount of optical access. He can shoot lasers in through the side windows, observe, in this case, the lasers are aligned with the spray itself. And you can observe what's going on in the chamber through this bottom window using a variety of optical techniques. It's a heavy-duty engine, a truck-size engine. So the bore here is 139 millimeters. Displacement 2.3 liters per cylinder, so it's one cylinder. The compression ratio is low, but he simulates the 16:1 compression ratio by boosting the intake and with the appropriate intake air temperature, such that at top dead center you would have the same pressure and temperature as you have in a 16:1 compression ratio engine. Fuel injector is a common rail, mini-sack type, 8 equally spaced holes. The spray included angle here is 152 degrees. Orifice diameter 196 microns. So the experiments that we looked at were experiments done by one of our students who spent a year working with Mark on high temperature combustion and low temperature combustion. And the experiments were carefully designed to allow you to look at cases that had short ignition delays and cases with medium ignition delays, and then the low temperature combustion, the long ignition delay, as would be the case with PCCI type combustion. Engine speed was the same in all cases. As I mentioned, for the PCCI combustion, the oxygen concentration was reduced, in other words, more dilution, and this is done with nitrogen and other species to represent, like CO2 and so on, to represent the constituents you would have with EGR. The load here was roughly the same, around 4 bar indicated mean effective pressure. In order to have a short ignition delay, his intake temperature was higher in those data, whereas here the medium data had a more typical intake temperature around 50 degrees. Low temperature was around 90 degrees. Let's see, any other parameters of interest here. You can see the flame temperatures estimated from the data being quite high for the high temperature combustion, 2700. You expect a lot of NOx from those type of runs. And here for the diluted case, much lower peak flame temperatures. Injection pressures over 1,000 bar. And then here, start of injection timing close to top dead center for the high temperature combustion cases, but 20 degrees before top dead center for the low temperature combustion. Interesting thing down here is the delay, is so-called ignition dwell. This means the time between the end of injection and the start of combustion. Minus sign means that you're still injecting before the end, as combustion starts, and the injection continues during combustion for 6 degrees. Here it continues for 1 degree. With +4, that means that the injection ended and there was a 4 crank angle delay before combustion was observed to start. So those are some of the main differences in the data set here. So I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail in a minute, but I just wanted to give you a feel for the overall results here. So here you see cylinder pressure versus crank angle for the short ignition delay and medium ignition delay, high temperature combustion, and the long ignition delay, low temperature combustion cases. This curve you see here is the injection rate shape. And you'll notice here the injection is just ending and ignition takes place, whereas here there's a delay between the end of injection and start of combustion. And here you have injection going on during the combustion. You can see from the heat release curve here that basically we have a diesel type premix burn followed by a diffusion burn. And that seems to disappear here as we go to the medium ignition delay case, and there's very little evidence of a premix burn in the case of the low temperature combustion. So the data that you see here, the results are basically shown at a certain crank angle at the same time as at the experiments. If you can see, I don't know how hard it is to see, but there's blue parts of the curves here, of the data here in the modeling. They represent the spray droplets. And then the green represents OH contours. And then here is the experimental data where in order to determine whether they were actually looking at OH with the PLIF, they used online and offline filtering to determine essentially where the OH was located. And I'm going to show more details of the experiments and the modeling in a minute. Okay, so let's look first at conventional diesel combustion. Here you see the experimental data and the simulation. There's a reasonable agreement. The calculations of the red dashed line here don't get quite as much of the premix burn in the calculation, but overall it's a fairly good agreement. So the simulation results are shown over here, and you see the injection occurring. And I'm going to stop this here just at the beginning of the premixed burn part. You can start to see some regions surrounding the injected liquid here where there's evidence of aldehyde, formaldehyde starting to appear. That would be kind of the precursor to the second stage combustion. The second stage combustion is characterized by plenty of OH, and that's shown in the green that surrounds the plume here. So we're looking at just one of the plumes here, and here's the experimental plume at that same time. You can see very good agreement in terms of the shape of the jet and even the thickness of the OH plume around the plume. This red region that you see here is the acetylene. So that would be our soot precursor, if you like, in the rich interior of the jet, just like in John Deck's experimental conceptual model. And this is, by the way, right at the peak of the premix burn. So we continue on a little bit. Now we're at the end of the premix burn. You can see we're starting to have some influence with the piston bowl wall. Remember, this is the piston bowl here, and the other circle is the liner. So this is a cylindrical bowl engine. Continue on a little bit further. And now you start to see some influence of the jet impinging on the piston bowl wall. It's spreading out along the wall, like we saw in some of those diesel movies before. Soot, again, in the center of each plume, and surrounded by this OH layer where the high temperatures are mostly located. And if you look at John Deck's image, essentially we're seeing something that looks very consistent. We have the intact liquid, or the liquid length. You can see that over here. The lifted flame sitting downstream where you've had sufficient air entrainment to cause ignition. Then we have the diffusion flame surrounding the jet and the rich interior. So that looked very encouraging. The simulations and the experiments show this diffusion flame has a thickness of roughly 1 to 2 millimeters. If we look at the model results, I mentioned that we used both the G equation model and the volumetric or well-stirred reactor volumetric ignition model. we were able to essentially try to analyze the role of flame propagation. So this is looking at the calculated results at a particular crank angle during the combustion process. The lines that you see here represent the G equals 0 surface. Remember I said that this identifies the flame location, if you like. And the color along each of these lines represents, in this case, the equivalence ratio locally along the G equals 0 surface, or in this case, the turbulent flame speed. And as you can see, along the G equals 0 surface, we have on the rich side here, rich equivalence ratios. On the lean side, we have lean equivalence ratios. And then right here at where these two lines meet, and we have the flame liftoff location, the equivalence ratio is roughly unity. So this is the typical edge flame configuration that you see in combustion textbooks. And it's gratifying to see that the G equation model picks that up. However, if we ran this same code without the G model, we found very similar results, because in terms of the background here, gray, shown in gray, which is the OH, the location of the OH. So essentially, the results show that the flame propagation model predicts this edge or triple flame structure right here at the nose. And the stoichiometric region is the only part where you see non-negligible flame speed. If you look at the turbulent flame speed, it's very low everywhere, as we discussed when we were talking about turbulent flames, except right here at the liftoff point, where the turbulent flame speed was actually similar to the laminar flame speed. Okay, so let's look now at the low temperature combustion case. So here's the injection profile. Here's the combustion process, which basically looks like it goes off with a bang. So here you have the injection occurring. You saw that the liquid jet penetrated a certain distance before it was completely vaporized. And now we're seeing this first stage of combustion, little evidence of that in the heat release curve here. And a lot of precursor species, the aldehyde, filling the entire region where the vapor had penetrated. Okay, so that corresponds to the peak of the low temperature combustion part, or the first stage combustion part. Then we continue on till the peak of the second stage combustion. And now you see that that aldehyde has been converted into this green OH here. So we've transitioned to the second stage combustion. This is a piece of the experimental image, and we basically see OH in the image and in the calculation at the same place. This increased mixing time basically allows the OH to fill the entire cross-section of the jet, as was seen in the experiments. You'll notice we're starting to predict a little bit of acetylene right up against the wall. If you look back at that movie I showed earlier with the PCCI combustion images, we saw the same thing. There was the bright regions around the edge of the combustion chamber, indicating the presence of particulates. This is a little bit later in time. And then at the end of the apparent heat release, you see these large regions of OH consistent with the experimental data. So comparing that with Mark Musculus's low temperature combustion conceptual model, you see we're seeing something very similar to that. For each of these jets, we've created a vortex that looks very similar to the experimental data. Of course, this jet has impinged against the bowl wall here. And in the interior region, we saw the evidence of the aldehydes and the first stage combustion products. So that was kind of gratifying to see the models can pick up those details. So looking, just to summarize then, the dependence of the flame structure on the mixing time, going from the high temperature combustion to the low temperature combustion, we saw an increase in mixing time between the fuel and the air. And for the high temperature short ignition delay cases, we saw this flame being surrounded by a rather thin sheath of OH, the diffusion flame thickness being 1 to 2 millimeters. Then when we went to the medium ignition delay, I didn't actually show the movie, but from the movies and the computed results, we saw the flame becoming thicker, more like 4 to 6 millimeters, also in agreement with the experiments, as you can kind of see from here. And then finally, for the low temperature combustion case, the OH filling the entire cross-section of the jet. So, interesting thing, and I'm showing you here the simulation results obtained without using the G equation model, is that we are able to capture the structure of the flame without considering any turbulence chemistry interactions. Each computational cell is a well-stirred reactor, and basically the only effect of turbulence is to basically provide large-scale mixing processes. So in training the air into this jet, the flame structure basically is captured without having to make any kind of postulate about within a cell, a subgrid scale mixing and combustion process. And I guess that's not too surprising. If the diffusion flame is on the order of 1 or 2 millimeters in thickness and our cell sizes are of the order of 1 or 2 millimeters, then basically everything is homogeneous within those cells anyway. So essentially the combustion would be controlled by how fast you can entrain air into those jets, and that's a large-scale mixing problem, not a small-scale mixing problem. So the other thing that these results show is that the dependence on chemistry is such that the injection-generated mixing will, of course, decrease as you increase the ignition delay, and the chemistry will become more and more important. But that's also allowed time for spreading of the fuel-air mixture in such a way that you have a more homogeneous mixture in the combustion chamber. So basically, the combustion-generated mixing will dominate the injection-generated mixing in this low-temperature combustion regime. The flame thickness also is a useful thing to monitor because it really reflects the local equivalence ratios, as I showed you in those G equation, those G surface contour plots. From those contour plots, we can see, for instance, the equivalence ratio at the edge of our diffusion flame, defining the edge using a certain value of the OH mass fraction, to be, say, on the inside 1.65, and on the outside the lean limit 0.35. And that's our 1 or 2 millimeters thickness diffusion flame. So you can see that within this OH region, we have a variation in equivalence ratio. And in fact, it's been postulated by work done also at Sandia that you can use the OH field to really represent the equivalence ratio. So in the long ignition delay case here, by looking at the OH concentration, you can correlate regions of high OH concentration with high equivalence ratio and low OH with low equivalence ratio. So there's a correlation between the zone thickness and the equivalence ratios, as shown in these simulations. So the other thing, just to get a little bit more deeply into the issue of turbulence and chemistry, what Sage Cookjohn did here in these simulations was to compare some of the characteristic times during the combustion process. So this is the high temperature combustion. Yeah. It's a measure of the equivalence ratio, yeah. Obviously, if it's too lean, you're not going to see any flame. If it's too rich, you're not going to see any flame. Right, and that's what you saw in the low temperature combustion case. You spread the equivalence ratio over a larger range, right? Well, yeah, the correlation may be different, but the point is that you can see here regions with high OH also correspond to regions with high equivalence ratio, even in the low temperature combustion case with EGR. But yeah, but the correlation could be different, yeah. Okay, so here are some simulations that reveal some interesting things. Here we're looking at the high temperature combustion short ignition delay case, and there's a lot of curves on this plot here. Here you see the injection rate, all right? So you see injection is occurring during combustion. The heat release profile is shown dotted here. You see the premixed burn and then the diffusion burn. The other curves show some other interesting parameters. The first let's look at is this here, FCR, the fuel consumption rate. So you basically look at the whole combustion chamber and observe how the fuel consumption is proceeding, at what rate is the fuel being consumed. And you can non-dimensionalize that in such a way as to produce the time scale dependence of 1 over time. So at the beginning of combustion, you see some gradual fuel consumption as the fuel is being converted to first stage combustion products like the aldehydes. And there's very little evidence of that in the heat release profile, but there's not a lot of energy associated with that conversion. Just at the point where you start to see an increase in the heat release is where you start to see a big increase in the fuel consumption rate, and then the two are correlated as the combustion process continues. Shown here is the turbulence timescale, or the inverse turbulence timescale, epsilon over k, all right? Also in units of 1 over time. And you can see that during the injection, we create a lot of turbulence because of the injection process, right? The big velocity gradient between the injected fluid and the stagnant ambient creates gradients which lead to source terms in the turbulence equations, creating turbulence. So you have mixing going on during this process here. And there is a correlation between the turbulence timescales for mixing and the combustion process. So that's what you'd see for the high temperature combustion case. And remember that here we saw the structure of the jet as shown here, just showing you at the peak heat release point. So the conclusion is that basically you have a kinetically controlled premix spike followed by mixing controlled energy release, as is conventionally thought of in diesel combustion. The turbulent mixing due to the injection event is high during the energy release because we're continuing to inject during the combustion process. And the reaction, or the fuel conversion rate, is controlled by the rate of transport of reactive material into that reaction zone from both the interior and the outside of the diffusion flame. So looking at the medium ignition delay case, you see here those same plots again. Here is the injection rate shape, all right? If you recall, the injection was ending before we started to see combustion start. Here you see the fuel consumption rate in red. Again, we start to see fuel being consumed and converted into those first stage combustion products, the aldehydes. And during that process, you can still see there is evidence that the turbulence that was generated by the jet is quite high, but it's actually ending over here because the injection is ramping down. So the effect of turbulence is becoming less and less important toward the end of the injection. And yet, right here is where we see the ignition occurring. So you can see that the ignition is really a chemical process, or dominated by chemistry effects, starting to be dominated by chemistry effects, because the turbulence is ramping down. So if we just look at what is said here, turbulent mixing rate starts to decrease prior to the auto-ignition, and the second spike in mixing, it's this black line here, is again combustion-generated turbulence, all right? The turbulence time scale is decreasing because the injection's ending, but here you get the big bang. The fuel that has been injected starts to burn in a very steep burn. That generates turbulence, which gives you that second spike of mixing. So the spray-induced mixing becomes less important as the time between the end of injection and the start of combustion approaches 0. And that's really emphasized here in the final plot, where you see the turbulence due to the spray. Here's our injection profile. The turbulence due to the spray has basically died away almost completely. The fuel is, of course, being converted to intermediate products in the red line that you see here due to chemistry, that first stage low temperature chemistry. But you don't see much heat release until suddenly everything goes off with a bang because of the chemical effect. So the turbulent mixing basically plays a secondary role to the kinetics, as you might expect. Okay, I want to now switch gears, so let me just ask if there are any questions about diesel combustion. Yeah.
So the previous slide, so is this implying that the premix combustion generates the most amount of resistance?
So yeah, the time scales that you see here, you can compare them. This is just looking at the K epsilon time scale over the whole chamber, all right? And basically what's happening is as you burn, temperatures are increasing, densities are changing, so that causes expansion of the fluid, which generates gradients, which generates turbulence. So I'm not sure that you can think of it directly that way. It's more a question of expansion due to combustion that's controlling the turbulent timescales, the mixing timescales. So, okay. I'll come back. Sure. The question is this the same as HCCI? More or less. Of course, you don't have this part of the turbulence created by injection, because the injection is occurring 20 degrees before top dead center. In this case, with homogeneous charge compression ignition, you might inject at top dead center of intake, many, many crank angles before, and then your turbulence would just be the turbulence generated in the combustion chamber due to swirl, breakdown, and so on. So you would be missing this part, but this part would be the same. Yeah, right. This is PCCI, which is very much like HCCI. 2200. That happened to be what you get if you use the oxygen ratio that he had here, which was around 12%. If you went lower than that, you would lower the temperatures even further. You had another question?
Yeah, in the flame dependence of flame structure on mixing time, so it seems that as the ignition delay increases, the diffusion flame gets thicker.
Right. So the question is, does the flame get thicker as the mixing time increases? Yes.
Yeah, it looks, that's what the numbers say. But my question is that when ignition delay increases, the combustion favors more premix, and the diffusion actually gets reduced, but the diffusion flame itself is bigger.
So your question really relates to what is a diffusion flame. Some people don't like the word diffusion flame because, like in these examples, you're actually operating in a mixed regime where parts of the flame are pre-mixed, parts of them are devoid of air or fuel, so therefore they're more like a diffusion flame. So this you could think of as a mixed combustion regime. All right? Yeah. Right. Right. Right, because the question is the turbulence chemistry interaction small? And the answer is yes, because at the scale that we're looking at here, it's the large-scale structures that are doing all the mixing. All right, and the final mixing down to the level of the cell is occurring fast enough that you can get away using a well-stirred reactor concept for each computational cell. All right, but within that cell, if you're looking at much shorter timescales than we're resolving, obviously there's going to be some mixing process that's helped by the turbulence. And in fact, I'm going to get to discussing that a little bit more next, because we'll be talking about spark ignition engines in a minute. And as I told you last time, if you're looking at a turbulent flame, with all those flamelets inside that computational cell that you're not resolving, now you have a problem. But for this type of combustion, where essentially the combustion is controlled by large-scale mixing, you don't need to worry about turbulent chemistry interaction. Right. Well, okay. So, but also in low temperature combustion, you have lots of time for mixing. See, so that's the issue. It's, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's just start on the subject of spark ignition engines, and I want to get to discussing NOC. Well, what is NOC anyway? It's chemistry, right? Fast chemical reaction. But before I get to that, I want to first just review what we discussed last time about spark ignition modeling. So a typical engine would have a fuel injector. In this case, it's a side-mounted injector. We have a spark plug. As I showed you before, we can model the spark plug event using our particle model. Actually, it's kind of interesting. You see we have what looks like a real spark plug here. We represent that with particles. We use the same spray model particles, except these ones are stationary, and we insert them in the domain in such a way that they, the boundary condition is enforced that the flow should have zero velocity in the vicinity of the spark plug. We do that by giving those particles a huge drag coefficient. So it's just a trick. You can represent a spark plug that way. Other people have even represented valves using particles in simulation. So it's just an interesting idea. Here's a case where the injector is actually at the center, and you want to make sure you spray past the spark plug in such a way that the equivalence ratios are suitable for ignition at the time of combustion, start of combustion. So these would be direct injected engines as opposed to the port fuel injected engine that I spoke about last time. This just shows a movie with our spray models, the particle ignition kernel model, the ChemKen-G spray flame propagation model, PRF chemistry, and the NOx mechanism. So here's your injected spray, there's your ignition, and combustion. And the color contours here are temperatures. Let's just show that one more time, the spray, ignition. So this black line that you see in the plots here is the G equals 0 surface. And behind that you have high temperature gases being compressed also by the propagating flame. And the flame is propagating out into this pent roof combustion chamber geometry. So we had a project with Ford, and they allowed us to publish some of the data where they provided experimental data, and I'm showing you the solid lines of the simulations. There's a cylinder pressure versus crank angle, and we're looking at a sweep here of spark timings from 20 before top dead center to, what is that there, 30, 32 before top dead center. So you see the heat release is advancing as I go from 20 to 32. So basically there's more time at high temperature with the early spark case, which of course would lead to higher NOx. All right? So this is from the pressure trace. So you make a measurement of the pressure trace, use the first law of thermo to convert that into an apparent heat release. All right? It does require that you spend a lot of time understanding a pressure trace. All right? Because as you'll see when I talk about NOC in a minute, there's a lot of information in a pressure trace that you have to make sure you don't get confused with. All right, so here's spark timing. They wouldn't let us give the actual NOx numbers, but this just shows normalized NOx. And at least the trend is correct, right? That as you advance your, or rather, as you start your spark timing closer to top dead center, you get less time available for NOx formation, and so less NOx. Some discrepancy between the experimental and measured and simulated NOx, but at least the trend is correct here. This is relatively early work too, so I think we've had some improvements since then. This shows the unburned hydrocarbons, and we were kind of worried here because our simulations basically showed much lower hydrocarbons than the experiments. And then we realized that if you go back to the movie, in the case of a stratified charge calculation, there are regions ahead of the flame where basically the flame is traveling in this tiny little channel here, where the flame speeds are decreasing. And in fact, we believe that that's really the origin of the unburnt hydrocarbons. The flame essentially stops propagating across the chamber. And to sort of show the effect of that, we introduced this idea of flame quench by looking at the local length scales of the turbulence and comparing them to the laminar flame thickness times some constant here, which we obtained from the literature. And you see that if you use this constraint, you look at the local length scales, and you argue that the turbulence has reached the point where on that bogey diagram you are predicting you're in the quench region, and you set the flame speed equal to 0, you start to see an increase in the prediction of the unburnt hydrocarbon. There is also other reasons why there might be differences. You know, we're talking about a multi-cylinder engine with cylinder-to-cylinder variability. We also are not discussing crevice flows here. So there's many reasons why you might have quantitative disagreement, but at least the trends are reasonable. Yeah. That's correct. So negative means before top dead center. Yeah. Okay, so remember we discussed last time the role of turbulence in spark ignition engine combustion. And I'm just going to repeat what I showed you last time when we were talking about premix charge. That basically the flame propagation process is controlled by the G equation model, which basically specifies the turbulent flame velocity. If you don't do that and you just assume that kinetics is the only combustion mechanism, in other words, you use the well-stirred reactor concept that we've got away with the diesel, you find that you just cannot predict the combustion, the rate of combustion reasonably at all. So that was for the premixed charge case. For the cases I just showed you, which are for direct injection, now you have that spray that was injected that's generating the turbulence. It's mixing the fuel and the air in such a way that now a well-stirred reactor model actually works quite well, just like in the diesel engine. So the conclusion really is here that if you have adequate mixing, say due to a spray, then the kinetics, the mixing has already been done for you. And the kinetics obviously then serves to reflect whatever the local mixing created and gives you a reasonable result. But if that mixing hasn't been done, you need a separate model. And I showed you this plot also before, where with the G equation model, you could see the flame propagating across the combustion chamber, which was obviously what must have been happening because we get good agreement with experimental data. Whereas if we don't allow the flame propagation model to be enacted, and we rely simply on the diffusion term in the equations and the chemistry term in the equations, we find very slow combustion in disagreement with the experiment. So let me just summarize this, and we'll take a break. The conclusion is auto-ignition chemistry alone is not enough to properly model flame propagation. So if you have a combustion situation where you can see evidence of flame propagation, you have to model that flame separately. The turbulence enhancing effect on flame propagation speed in premixed charge engines cannot be neglected. In other words, that turbulence chemistry interaction that we were discussing is occurring sub-grid scale in a spark ignition engine and has to be accounted for. However, in direct injected engines, where the combustion is controlled by mixing rates, right? You're mixing the fuel and the air due to injected spray, for instance, then your fuel-air mixture is already prepared for combustion, and now you only have to worry about the chemistry. So this is a significant observation, because a lot of people spend their time working on turbulence chemistry interaction, and then they say, well, I'm going to use it in a diesel engine. And I say, you don't need that, because the fuel's already mixed with the air. Yeah. Absolutely. So you have to have sufficient mixing. And, you know, the other extreme is when you have very early injection, like in an HCCI engine, you again don't have to worry about that, because you've already mixed the fuel in the air. You had many crank angles to do that. So it's only in a tiny regime where you're still relying on sub-grid scale, if you like, sub-millimeter scale mixing to mix the fuel and the air sufficiently for combustion. Yeah. You mean in these pictures here? Yeah, over here? It would be in either case. I mean, if you have a homogeneous charge and you ignite it with a spark, now the mixing is not the fuel and the air, but it's the mixing of the high temperature combustion products with the low temperature reactants that needs to be modeled. And that's where the turbulence chemistry interaction would take place. Okay, I used the example of fuel-air mixing because I was talking about sprays here. Not necessarily. I'm going to talk about knock after the break, all right, where you don't have heat release due to flame propagation. It's purely chemistry. All right, so any other questions? One more? Yeah.
So there was some discrepancy with your knock simulation.
Right.
Sorry, the hydrocarbon simulation results with the experiment. And you were talking about flame quenching, and you showed some things from your video of the channel flame quenching. Could you explain that?
So the question is these hydrocarbons, and all I'm saying is that because of this combustion chamber geometry, it's very difficult for this flame to propagate all the way to the edges of the combustion chamber. You see how it's narrowing down in this triangular pent roof configuration. So at a certain moment, your heat losses to the walls and the piston are so large that you stop combustion.
So this is more applicable to this particular design of board.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Why do they use a pent roof? Because they want a lot of turbulence, and generating the turbulence is crucial for a higher flame velocity. But one of the side things is that at the end of combustion, you have quenching.
The same effect occur in a diesel combustion piston, if you have like the bowl shape of the flame, specifically when you run higher.
Right, but with there, you keep the fuel away from those edge regions because you're injecting the fuel into the center of the combustion chamber. In this case, you saw the spray. It was kind of a, let me see if I can show that again. It was more or less confined in the piston bowl region, but you do have some spray being pushed into the so-called squish region above the piston, and kind of lean mixtures that don't want to burn anyway. Here's another question. No. We should, I guess. I did mention yesterday that we are looking at fuel films that are formed on, like in an engine like this, where you'd have a fuel film on the piston. We consider that film and its vaporization and pyrolysis to produce soot, but we don't consider chemistry between the surface and the film, which would be important if you were trying to predict deposits, for example. Okay, so let's meet at 10 o'clock then.